Hello fellow Shadowers, welcome to my very first video on my channel, Kage That's Not Shadows. Today we will be talking about Pontianak, which is a mystical creature that finds its origin in ancient Malay mythology. It is a malicious flesh-eating female ghost in Malaysian, Singaporean and Indonesian folklore. The figure resembles that of the spirit of a woman, and according to traditional belief, the Pontianak ghost is that of a woman who died while pregnant with her child during labor. Pontianak is often described as a frightening female ghost and appears in a white dress with long hair, pale skin, bloody red eyes and having razor-sharp fingernails. Her dress is normally smeared with the blood of her previous victim. Notably, a Pontianak is said to have a hole at the back of her neck. They are also capable of changing into a more monstrous form upon having captured suitable prey. Pontianak is also able to transform herself into an attractive lady in order to lure her victim. Even though the Pontianak is a ghostly spirit, it can appear as if it's a real human being. Its human appearances is mainly characterized by female beauty. The Pontianak attempt to seduce men before leading them to their terrible demise. Pontianak can be fended off by driving a nail into the hole on the nape of her neck, which causes her to turn into a beautiful woman. There had been debates regarding the reason why Pontianak mostly attacked men. Some suggest it as an act of revenge of men who had wronged her, resulting in her pregnancy. In some version of the folklore, men will actually seek to capture Pontianak with the assistance of shaman. The captured Pontianak will later be subdued by driving a nail into its neck. By doing this, make her turn into a human and a loyal wife unless the nail is removed. Well, those must be very desperate men. A Pontianak usually arrives during a full moon and announces her presence through high-pitched laughter, similar to this. Her presence can also be detected by fragrance of frangipani flowers from a distance, followed by a stench of rotten flesh as it gets closer to her victim. Once she had her victims, Pontianak unveiled its demonic natures and appeared as a terrifying creature indeed. With her unusually long and sharp nails, the Pontianak devours the body of its victim, ripping the organ from the inside and proceeds to feed on it. The victim will be helplessly eaten alive. Pontianak is often considered to be the ghost of a deceased person. Therefore, the spirit remains in a state of chaos and confusion after it dies a violent death. Failure to recognize and accept its death causes the spirit to get trapped between our world and the next. Being trapped, Pontianak accumulates unwholesome karma through committing evil deeds. This accumulation of bad karma prevents the wandering spirit to pass on to the next life where it awaits a more fortunate rebirth. For this reason, shamans often like to help the spirit accumulate merits and virtue so that they can proceed to the next life. The shaman will have to perform various sinister rituals at the grave of the deceased person, where he engages in extensive acts of ritual worship while chanting various spells. This requires great strength of mind and concentration, as the spirit of the deceased person will attempt to attack the shaman by whom it is invoked. Next, the shaman has to bind the vengeful spirit through powerful spells. Once the harmful ghost is subdued, the shaman expresses his intention of goodwill and explains that he wishes to help the spirit as an act of compassion. Once the spirit recognizes his true intention, she will give the shaman permission to continue the ritual. The shaman may then proceed to extract bodily fluid from the corpse. This part of the ritual involves the use of a candle that will be used to burn the flesh of the chin of the female body with. The dripping fat from the burnt chin is collected in a tiny bottle. Later, the content of the bottle is mixed with various other ingredients to enhance the mystical power of the oil. This oil is called minyak dagu, meaning chin oil. It is considered to be an extremely powerful magic item which can be used for enchantment and seduction of the opposite sex. This oil can also be fetched for a high price, especially in Indonesia and Malaysia. Since the Pontianak has agreed to the strict rule imposed by the shaman, the female spirit thereby is given the opportunity to perform good deeds through serving human beings and to fulfill their wishes. Ultimately, through performing this act of goodwill, the Pontianak accumulates enough good karma which allow the spirit to be reborn. There exists a city in West Kalimantan, Indonesia named Pontianak. According to legend, Sharif Abdul Rahman, the first sultan of the Pontianak kingdom, was hunted by a vengeful Pontianak. The kingdom was built on the swamp along the west coast of Kalimantan. In spite of the local inhabitants' advice to establish the kingdom elsewhere, the sultan remained indifferent towards the belief of the local population of Kalimantan. The sultan and his army fought and extricated the ghosts who attacked his group by shooting cannonballs. The fight lasted a few days before the Pontianak was finally defeated. He then built a mosque and a palace exactly on the location of the ghost nest and settled his kingdom. The mosque and the palace became the very first building in Pontianak city. To this day, residents of Pontianak city shoot fake cannons every Ramadan and holiday events to pay tributes to the sultan. Pontianak had remained in public mind in a region where her myths had started. Multiple movies and TV shows from various countries had been produced and watched by the younger generations. In the past, she often portrayed as a mindless monster, but recently, her stories are told much more accurately. Some of the best movies are such as Pontianak Harum Sundal Malam from Malaysia, Kuntilanak from Indonesia, and Revenge of the Pontianak from Singapore. Her image and the terrifying stories which had existed in people's minds will live regardless of changing times, and once in a while she will make an appearances in mainstream news over her sighting to show that she still exists among us. Thank you for staying to the end of the video. For men out there, let me know if you will be taking risks into turning a Pontianak as your wife, and comment below on the next ghost story you want me to cover. Me Kage, wishing you all a restless night.